Can you tell me a story, Sage Kaltor? The young Saranai Cora asked, her voice filled with the eager curiosity of youth. She nestled closer to the elder. Kaltor smiled, his feathers rippling gently in the night breeze.
Yes, little one. Why don't I tell you the story of the day in the life of a fungi farmer?
Ugh, no, Cora interrupted, her plumage fluffing up in protest. That one is so boring. I want to hear about the Terrans, something scary. Kaltor chuckled softly, shaking his head at the enthusiasm.
You young ones always want excitement. You know, the Terrans have a way of telling their stories to be more than they are.
That's what makes them so amazing, Cora beamed, her eyes wide with anticipation.
Very well, little one,
Kaltor said, settling into the story.
But keep in mind, humans live short lives. It alters their view of things sometimes. Their tales can be grander than the truth. Let me tell you about the Battle of the Black Sands.
Kaltor's plumage settled as he began.
4 years before that battle, the Dragon Emperor had attacked the Terrans. His warriors descended upon one of their islands. The attack sudden and fierce. Thousands perished in the flames. Cities were reduced to ash, and the sky was choked with smoke. Wives and children were left grieving. But the leader of the Terrans swore they would avenge their fallen. The Dragon Emperor had awoken something in the Terrans far greater than he could have known. It was then that the war truly began.
The Dragon Emperor attacked first? Cora asked. Kaltor nodded.
Yes, little one. Listen closely. The Terrans' response was swift and relentless. They fought their way across the seas, retaking the islands that made up the Emperor's territory, winning victory after victory. But they knew their true test awaited them on a small, barren island of black sands. Here, the Empire would make its stand.
Kaltor's voice lowered, drawing Cora deeper into the tale.
The Dragon Emperor's command was simple. Stand to the last man. And his general, Curie, was a fearsome warrior, loyal beyond measure. It is said that the Dragon Emperor had gifted him the ability to breathe fire in battle, a reward for his loyalty. I will not fail you, Emperor, Curie had sworn.
Cora interrupted. Could he really breathe fire? Kaltor smiled, his feathers shimmering in the dim light.
That's what is said. Now, General Curie had a plan. He had transformed the island into a fortress. Beneath the sands, his warriors had dug deep, creating tunnels and strongholds hidden from the surface. The Terrans, meanwhile, arrived in force. Thousands of them, with warships and planes, their metal beasts filling the skies. Their leader, Captain Nimitz, a great Terran hero, looked over the battle plans and declared, "This will be easy." The island seemed small and defenseless. No fresh water, no cover for the defenders. It appeared to be a simple task.
Yes, sir, one of Nimitz's officers agreed. Our reconnaissance shows little resistance. This should be over in a couple of days. Kaltor leaned closer, his voice darkening.
But the Terrans underestimated General Curie. Beneath the surface of that barren island, his forces lay in wait. The Terrans opened with a bombardment from their warships, raining hellfire down upon the black sands. For days they pounded the island, turning it into a desolate wasteland. But the defenders did not emerge.
Cora asked nervously, did they think they had won? Kaltor nodded.
They did. But then something unexpected happened. One of the Terran warships strayed too close to the island, within range of the hidden guns. Explosions ripped through its hull, killing Marines and sailors alike. The Terrans realized, too late, that Curie had fortified the island far better than they had thought.
Kaltor paused for a moment, letting the weight of the tale settle in.
The Terrans had planned for 10 full days of bombardment, but orders came down from high command.
"Sir," said a communications officer, "Navy Command has reduced the bombardment to 3 days. They say it's a waste of resources."
"What?" General Smith, the Terran commander, snarled. "Do they expect me to send my Marines to their deaths?"
"They believe the island's defenses are weaker than we know them to be," the officer replied, hesitantly. Kaltor's voice grew grim.
"Damned fools," Smith muttered. He knew what lay ahead.
Cora bristled with anticipation as the story unfolded. What happened next? Kaltor's feathers flared slightly, his voice dropping.
"The day of the landing came. The Terran landing craft circled the waters like hungry sharks, their numbers swelling with each passing moment. Then the craft lined up, ready to storm the beaches. The order was given, and the line broke, heading straight for the shore."
He paused, his gaze fixed on the young one.
What the Terrans didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the moment they set foot on those black sands, they were stepping into a death trap. As the Terran forces approached the beach, one soldier joked, "After this bombardment, you think any of the Dragon's forces will be left?" His fellow soldiers chuckled nervously, though they all knew the truth. Beneath their laughter there was a tension. The black sands ahead held secrets, and soon they would discover how dangerous those sands really were. The armored vehicles rolled onto the shore, their engines roaring and belching thick black smoke into the air. Large guns mounted on top scanned the desolate landscape. But as soon as the heavy machines hit the beach, they slowed. The coarse, black sand dragged at their treads, whirring down the mechanical parts. The grit clogged the moving gears, and the vehicles struggled to advance.
Cora giggled, amused at the lack of foresight. The tanks got stuck? Kaltor glanced down at her.
"You may laugh, little one," he said, "but the truth was, the Dragon's general was preparing to strike." In an instant, the mountain above the beach exploded in flashing lights. The Terran soldiers stood frozen for a moment, staring in confusion. Then they realized the flashing wasn't sunlight or a reflection. It was the incoming breath of the Dragon. And then, all at once, madness descended. The beach, once thought safe, became a killing ground. The stuck vehicles became deadly obstacles. Soldiers fell left and right, caught in a storm of gunfire from the Dragon's warriors. The enemy had the upper hand. They would appear, fire from hidden positions, and then vanish, almost as if by magic. The Terrans were fighting an invisible enemy, one that never left an opening. "Damn," one soldier muttered, crouching for cover. "Not getting hit out here is gonna be like trying to run through the rain without getting wet." Another soldier came up beside him, looking at the cliffs rising ahead. "Hey, what's with the cliffs? I thought intel said it was supposed to be flat." "Guess not," the first soldier grumbled. "Well, what am I supposed to do with the vehicles? They can't climb that." "I don't know. Figure it out. Get some engineers over here and clear us a path," an officer barked. "On it, sir," came the quick reply. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, a hero was on the move. Sergeant Basilone, an enormous Terran built like a walking tank. He had already earned medals for his bravery in battle, and now he was back, eager to fight again for the Terran cause. But at the moment, his squad was pinned down, trapped under the fire of a bunker up ahead. "Cover me, boys," Basilone called out. "I'm going in." "That's suicide, Sarge," one of his men shouted. "Someone's got to keep us moving forward," Basilone replied, determination blazing in his eyes. "It's suicide to stay here." Without waiting for a reply, he charged forward, his heart pounding as he sprinted across the battlefield. He reached the bunker, tossed a charge inside, and ducked for cover. A loud explosion reverberated across the battlefield, leaving the enemy bunker smoking. "Come on, boys, move up," Basilone called, his voice ringing with confidence. "I got him." The squad rushed forward, rallying behind him. "That was stupid, Sarge. You could have gotten yourself killed," one of his men said, panting. "You worry too much," Basilone replied with a grin. But before he could rejoin his men, something caught his eye. An armored vehicle was stuck, struggling to navigate a minefield, its crew hopelessly exposed without a spotter. "Hey," he called out to his squad, "I'll be right back." He walked into the minefield without hesitation, making his way toward the vehicle. Just as he neared it, a shell came down from the sky, a deafening roar filling the air. "No!" Cora screamed, bristling with shock. Kaltor stopped, looking down at her gently. "Oh, I'm sorry, little one. Perhaps this is too much for you." Cora shook her head, eyes wide. "No, it's okay. Please keep going. I need to know what happens." "Are you sure?" Kaltor asked, his tone soft. "Yes," Cora whispered. "I'm sure." Kaltor smiled at Cora's wide-eyed eagerness. "Okay, then. Where was I?" "I think you're about to kill Basilone," she said with a nervous tremor in her voice. "Oh, little one," Kaltor replied softly, his tone growing serious. "Are you sure you want me to continue?" Cora straightened up, stiffening with determination. "Yes, I want to hear the story." "Very well," Kaltor sighed. A deafening roar filled the air, but Basilone was okay. "Yes!" Cora exclaimed, her eyes lighting up. "Shh." Basilone was okay. He made it to the vehicle, attached a chain to the front of it, and, single-handedly, pulled it to safety. Kaltor leaned in as he continued. "See, boys," Basilone called out to his squad. "You just have to put your back into it." "And that, Sarge, is why they gave you the Medal of Honor," one of his men replied with a grin. Basilone gave them a confident wink. "Now come on, men. We've got to get these guns off the beach." Kaltor's voice grew softer as he continued. But as Basilone led the charge across the airfield, something terrible happened. He was cut down, struck by the dragon's forces, his body falling without warning. "What?" Cora cried, her plumage flaring. "But he was a hero!" "Cora," Kaltor said gently, "if you want me to tell the story, you must listen. This is a story of war, a great Terran battle. There will be death and tragedy." Kaltor's voice grew solemn. "The soldiers were shaken by Sergeant Basilone's death. He had been more than a man to them, a hero of unimaginable strength. And to see him cut down by the dragon's men was devastating." The elder paused for a moment, his eyes flickering as he remembered the story. It only got worse. On the west side of the island, the battle was at a stalemate. The dragon's forces had dug deep into the cliffs, shaping the rocks to be their cover. The Terrans tried everything to dislodge them, but the defenses were too strong.
Kaltor's voice lowered.
The losses were extensive. Explosions rocked the Terran forces at the base of the cliffs. The ground shook, and the night sky was lit by the sight of burning Terran vehicles. As the sun set, the darkness was only broken by the flames of war. The Terran leader gasped as he read the reports. The death counts, they were staggering. Thousands lost, and still the battle raged on.
Cora sat in silence, her gaze fixed on Kaltor, the story weighing heavily on her young heart. Kaltor's voice took on a more determined tone as he continued the tale.
The next morning, the Terrans began with a renewed vigor. Their losses had been great, but their resolve was greater. Supported by the battleships offshore, the Terrans launched another assault. This time, they were making progress at the West Cliffs. A lucky barrage from the ships triggered a landslide, sending rocks and debris crashing down onto the dragon's forces, taking out countless troops.
Cora's eyes widened in awe. So they were winning?
They were making progress,
Kaltor replied, nodding.
With the warships continuing their assault, the Terrans pressed forward. But while things were improving on the west side, the east was another story. The Terrans had the enemy pinned down, but the dragon's general had buried his defenses deep within the mountain. Every step forward was met with fierce resistance.
Kaltor paused, letting the weight of the struggle sink in.
What do we do to get rid of this infestation? One Terran thought aloud as they surveyed the battlefield, frustration clear in his voice. Another Terran, gripping a massive weapon, answered with grim determination. We burn him out, he said. In his hands was a monstrous weapon, one that spewed a gel so hot it burned like the breath of a dragon itself.
Cora gasped.
Like the dragon general?
Kaltor nodded solemnly.
Yes, the Terrans had their own fire, and they were not afraid to use it. Armed with this weapon, they eagerly set to work, clearing the defenses that had caused them so much frustration. They attacked the tunnels and strongholds where the enemy had dug in, flushing them out with fire.
His voice grew quiet, almost reflective.
That night, for the first time, the Terrans didn't have to watch their own vehicles burn. Instead, they watched the flames consume the enemy's defenses, lighting up the mountainside. It was a small victory, but one they needed. They took a moment to breathe, knowing that they were one step closer to breaking the dragon's hold on the island.
Cora sat in silence, imagining the glow of the flames flickering against the dark sky, the Terrans standing tall, their hearts filled with both exhaustion and hope. Kaltor's voice carried the weight of the battle as he continued.
The next morning, the Terrans worked slowly and deliberately to clear the remainder of the mountain. They called in airstrikes and bombardments, and the once dormant volcano seemed to come alive, smoke and fire billowing from the repeated explosions. Then the soldiers waited for the order to attack, but none came.
Cora's eyes flickered with impatience.
What was the holdup?
Kaltor mimicked the frustration of the soldiers.
Word is they can't get Shermans over here, one soldier muttered, staring at the mountain. Damn. Another cursed under his breath as they watched the soldiers slowly return to the positions that had been cleared just hours before. We can't wait any longer, said Colonel Horse, a hardened leader among the Terrans. We have to move. With that, the order was given, and the Terrans launched a brutal assault. Close quarters combat erupted as they stormed the remaining defenses. The opposing warriors fought fiercely, using every hidden position and stronghold to their advantage. The Terran forces had made it almost to the top when the defenses behind them came back to life, trapping them between two fronts. That's when the Terran flamethrowers came into play once again. They used supporting small arms fire to distract the fortified structures, sneaking up and dousing them in the burning gel. The tactic was highly effective. The Terrans continued to fill the bunkers and concrete strongholds with fire, taking the mountain inch by inch.
Cora's eyes widened as she imagined the chaos.
The Marines charged through, clearing out enemy forces. The battle was fierce. Slowly, the Terrans began to turn the tide. Finally, the Shermans arrived. Their large cannons tore through the remaining defenses, blasting the last pockets of resistance. The Terrans cleared the mountain, down to the last man.
Kaltor's voice softened.
By nightfall, the Terrans were just below the summit of the dormant volcano. Exhausted from the battle, they began to settle in, finally allowing themselves to rest. But just as they thought the fight was over, something appeared in the sky.
Cora's breath caught in her throat. What was it? Kaltor's eyes gleamed with tension.
Dragons. A formation of them, huge and terrifying, flying from the mainland to reinforce their troops on the island. Their massive wings beat the air as they approached, fire flickering in the distance.
Cora bristled.
Did they make it to the island?
Kaltor shook his head.
No. The Terrans had prepared for this. The warships surrounding the island opened fire as they neared. One by one, they were struck down, their bodies tumbling from the sky.
Cora's breath eased, but Kaltor wasn't finished.
One of the largest amongst them, its wings tattered from the fire of the warships, let out a final thunderous roar. With a final surge of energy, it turned toward the Terran fleet and found a target, the Bismarck. The beast dove with all its might, aiming directly at the ship.
Cora gasped, her eyes wide.
With its dying breath, the creature unleashed a torrent of fire. The flames tore through the Bismarck's hull, setting it ablaze. The crew tried to fight back, but the damage was too great. The beast's claws raked across the deck, tearing it in two, dragging the mighty ship down into the depths of the sea with it.
They lost the Bismarck? Cora whispered, her feathers trembling. Kaltor nodded solemnly.
Yes, little one. The Terrans lost a great ship and many men. But even as the Bismarck sank, the battle was not over. Another dragon, slightly smaller but no less deadly, let out its own final breath of flame. Its fire engulfed the Saratoga, one of the Terrans' other warships. The Saratoga's hull groaned under the weight of the attack, smoke pouring from its deck as the flames licked at the metal.
Cora's eyes widened. Did they lose the Saratoga too? Kaltor shook his head.
No. Though the Saratoga was badly damaged, the Terrans fought to keep her afloat. The crew worked tirelessly, refusing to let another of their ships fall. The Saratoga limped through the battle, but it did not sink.
Kaltor continued, his voice now calmer as the battle had reached a brief moment of reprieve.
The rest of the day passed with little incident. The Terrans had secured more than half the island, and though tensions remained high, there was a sense of relief in the air. That afternoon, something unusual happened. The secretary of the Terran Navy, who had been accompanying the fleet during this mission, decided to go ashore, eager to witness the success firsthand.
Cora tilted her head, curious.
Why would he want to go to the shore when the battle wasn't over?
Kaltor's feathers ruffled slightly in amusement.
Pride, little one. Victory had come at a great cost, and the sight of the Terran flag flying atop the hill was a symbol of their progress. As the secretary approached the shore, he saw that flag standing tall against the smoke-filled sky. It was a powerful image.
Cora asked eagerly with interest, "What did he do?" Kaltor smiled slightly.
Well, as they neared the shore, the secretary turned to the lieutenant general accompanying him and said, "I'd like that flag as a souvenir." It seemed like a harmless request, but it set off a chain of events none of the men on the ground were expecting. The general, following orders, phoned Colonel Johnson, who was in charge of the battalion that had raised the flag. He asked the colonel for the flag, expecting the request to be honored without question.
Kaltor's voice deepened, adding a hint of tension.
But Colonel Johnson did not take kindly to that request. He hung up the phone, visibly irritated. He looked at his men and said, "To hell with that. The flag belongs to the men of this battalion."
Cora gasped. He refused? Kaltor nodded.
He did. Johnson was a man who understood what that flag meant. It wasn't just a piece of cloth. It was a symbol of everything his men had fought for, bled for, died for. So instead of giving it up, he sent his assistant to find a replacement flag, calling after him, "And make it a bigger one."
Cora giggled, imagining the scene. Kaltor's feathers flicked with amusement as he continued.
The flags were quickly swapped out before the secretary arrived, none the wiser. The larger flag was raised in place of the original, and the men of the battalion kept their prize.
Cora's eyes gleamed. That's kind of funny. Kaltor chuckled.
Yes, little one. That night there was a well-deserved celebration. The men had secured a foothold on the island, and they had earned a brief moment of peace. They drank, they laughed, and for the first time since the battle began, they allowed themselves to believe they were on the road to victory.
But then Kaltor's tone shifted, growing somber.
But the worst was still to come. The battle was not over. The northern part of the island still held the dragon's fiercest warriors, and they were preparing to strike back with all the fury they could muster.
Cora's plumage flattened slightly, the weight of the story pressing down once more. What happened next? Kaltor's voice lowered as he continued.
The rest of the battle seemed straightforward. The Terrans planned a simple push across the northern airfield to the other side of the island. The day began with shelling the dragon's positions, their Sherman tanks rolling forward, Marines close behind. Victory felt within reach.
Cora leaned in, sensing the tension rising.
But then
Kaltor paused.
Disaster struck.
Cora fluttered nervously. What happened?
The dragon's forces had been waiting for this moment. Just as the Terran's tanks advanced, the enemy opened fire. Anti-armor rounds rained down from the ridges, taking out the Shermans one by one. The dragon's troops had the high ground, and they were ready.
Cora gasped. They were waiting for them? Kaltor nodded grimly.
Yes. The ridges above were hollowed out, concealing entire batteries of anti-tank weapons. The Terrans were exposed on the plateau below, No cover, no trees, just open ground. It was a slaughter. One of the Terran soldiers yelled to his comrade as the explosions rang out, "We're sitting ducks out here. Hold the line," came the reply from his sergeant, his voice straining to be heard over the chaos. "We need to take out those guns or we're done for."
Kaltor's voice lowered.
But they couldn't. For days, the two sides were locked in a stalemate. The Terrans would shell the Dragon's positions, only for the enemy to strike back with relentless fire from the ridges. No one gained ground. It was a grueling back and forth, day after day.
Cora shivered. That sounds awful.
It was.
Kaltor continued.
On the 9th day, a squad from the battalion that had raised the flag was making its way to the front lines. They were already battle-hardened, but war has a way of striking when you least expect it. A shot rang out.
Kaltor said urgently.
One of the men dropped, hit by a sniper. "They're picking us off," one of the soldiers shouted, diving for cover. The squad scrambled behind rocks, trying to figure out a way to escape the open ground. "What's the plan, Sarge?" another soldier asked, panting with fear. The sergeant scanned the horizon. "We're pinned down. There's no way forward unless we get air support, or..." But before he could finish, a massive explosion shook the earth. A friendly shell, meant for the enemy, fell short. The men screamed.
Kaltor shook his head.
A second explosion claimed another soldier, and before the squad could react, a mortar hit nearby, mortally wounding a third. He managed to shout, "They killed me," before slumping over.
Cora's crest flattened as she whispered,
"That's terrible."
Kaltor sighed.
It was. And the next day, Lieutenant Johnson, the one who had stored the original flag, was killed in a barrage. Out of all those who had helped raise the flag, only a few remained.
Cora sat silently, the weight of the story pressing down on her.
But then, Kaltor continued, something remarkable happened. Amidst all the carnage, a wounded Terran bomber, returning from a successful run, radioed the island, requesting clearance to land. "Permission granted," came the voice from the tower, and the pilot's reply was filled with relief. "Thank God for the Marines." The southern airstrip had been secured, Kaltor said, and the bomber touched down safely. The crew leapt from the aircraft, kissing the ground and shouting their thanks. For the Marines still fighting on the ground, it was a rare moment of joy.
Cora smiled slightly. "That's amazing." Kaltor nodded.
That was only the first. More than 2,000 such landings would take place as the Great War continued. Though the fight raged on, those pilots found safety on the island, thanks to the Terran forces.
He shifted his tone again.
But even as the Marines welcomed those grateful pilots, the battle wasn't over. The Terrans brought in more tanks, flame tanks equipped to shoot fire. They'd learned from their earlier success. One of the Marines on the front line called out, "These babies are gonna toast 'em good," as the flame tanks rolled in behind the regular ones.
Kaltor's feathers shimmered as he described the scene.
The strategy was simple. The regular tanks would blow a hole in the enemy fortifications, and the flame tanks would follow behind, filling the tunnels with fire. The enemy strongholds couldn't withstand the heat.
Cora's plumage rose, eager for the outcome.
Did it work?
Kaltor smiled slightly.
It worked, but the progress was slow. There were only a limited number of flame tanks, and the enemy's defenses were well entrenched. The battle would drag on, But with each step forward, the Terrans grew closer to victory.
Kaltor's voice deepened as the story reached a crucial turning point.
The enemy forces continue to frustrate the Terrans, he said. Every time they shelled the ridges or tried to push forward, the dragon's troops seemed to be waiting for them, undeterred. The stalemate dragged on, and the Terrans knew they needed to change their strategy.
Cora continued to listen intently, entranced by the story.
It was then that the decision was made,
Kaltor continued.
No more bombardments, the commander ordered. We'll approach them quietly, radio silent. No warning. We'll strike while they're off guard. The Terrans were eager for the change, fed up with fighting an enemy who always seemed to know what was coming.
He smiled slightly as he continued.
And so, the Terrans crept toward the enemy positions under the cover of night. No artillery to signal their advance. No radio chatter to give them away. They moved like shadows, ready for anything.
Cora whispered, "Did it work?" Kaltor chuckled softly.
Oh, it worked. Much to their surprise, when the Terrans arrived at the enemy's forward positions, they found them asleep.
Asleep? Cora blinked in surprise. Kaltor nodded, his voice carrying the faintest hint of satisfaction.
Yes, little one. The enemy, so used to hearing the thunder of artillery before any Terran attack, had grown complacent. They hadn't expected the Terrans to come silently, and the result was swift and brutal. The Terrans made quick work of them, clearing out the positions without losing the element of surprise.
Cora relaxed as the tension eased.
But the Terrans weren't done,
Kaltor said, his tone growing sharp again.
They pressed on, moving deeper into the enemy's territory, undetected. They had the advantage now, and they intended to keep it. As they continued forward, however, they were spotted by an enemy fortification.
Cora bristled.
What did they do?
Kaltor smiled.
They acted fast. Flamethrowers at the ready. The Terrans set the fortification ablaze before the enemy could react. The fire spread quickly, consuming the stronghold, and the Terrans pushed deeper into the dragon's territory.
Cora leaned forward, her eyes wide. Did they win? Kaltor nodded.
With the element of surprise on their side, they took out the remaining defenses quickly, moving from one position to the next. The dragon's forces, caught off guard, fell one after another. By the time the enemy realized what had happened, it was too late. Only a few of the dragon's final forces remained, and the Terrans had already secured most of the island.
Cora exhaled softly, her gaze fixed on Kaltor.
They did it. Yes, little one, they did. The battle was nearly won, but even with most of the island secure, the battle was not over yet. The Terrans had more challenges to face before the Dragon Emperor's forces would be truly defeated. It was nearly midnight when the dragon soldiers made what they thought would be their final, desperate effort. With little hope, they sought only to make their emperor proud. In a last-ditch act of loyalty, they strapped explosives to their bodies, ready to sacrifice themselves and take as many Terrans as possible with them.
Cora asked nervously, "They were going to blow themselves up?" Kaltor nodded solemnly.
Yes, little one. At the stroke of midnight, they left the safety of their bunker. "For the Empire!" they cried, silencing their radios as they charged into the darkness. Their general, General Curie, tried to stop them. "Don't do this," he pleaded over the radio. "We can do more alive than dead."
Cora's eyes widened. Did they listen? Kaltor shook his head.
No, his words were too late. Their communications had already gone silent. But the Terrans, they were ready. Throughout the day, they had noticed unusual enemy movement. They remained ever vigilant, prepared for an attack.
Kaltor's voice dropped, taking on a chilling tone.
The dragon's soldiers, full of fire and fury, were met with Terran artillery rounds and small arms fire. Their numbers dwindled quickly as they were caught in the deadly crossfire. One of the Terran soldiers shouted, "Hold the line! Don't let them get close!" Another called out, "They've strapped bombs to themselves!"
Cora trembled as she imagined the scene. Did any of them survive?
Kaltor nodded. A few. As the chaos unfolded, a dragon colonel managed to catch up with the remaining bombers. He carried a message from General Curie, ordering them to stand down and retreat. With their numbers decimated, the surviving soldiers, disheartened, complied.
Cora sighed.
So it was over? Not quite.
Kaltor said gravely.
As dawn broke, the Terrans surveyed the battlefield. The devastation was immense. Bodies lay scattered, the remnants of the dragon's once mighty forces. One Terran soldier looked out over the carnage and muttered, "They have to be running out of men."
And the general? Cora asked anxiously. Kaltor's eyes narrowed.
General Curie had retreated to the far north of the island. His units fiercely defended his withdrawal, and it was said that any who dared stand in his way were scorched by his legendary fire breath.
Cora gasped.
So he really could breathe fire? That's what they say,
Kaltor said with a slight smile.
Back at home, news of the battle had reached the Terran Republic. The death toll had shocked them. No island is worth this many lives, the people cried. Their voices echoed across the ocean, even reaching the black sands where the battle continued.
Kaltor's tone grew more serious.
In an attempt to calm the public, the battle was officially declared won, and a ceremony was held. But even as the speeches were made and the flag was raised again, the fighting continued on the northern end of the island. The Terrans pressed on, sending in flame tanks to systematically destroy the remaining pockets of resistance. The waves of fire slowly and methodically weeded out the last of the dragon's defenders.
So that was the end? Cora exclaimed. Kaltor's feathers ruffled as he leaned in.
No, little one. The final stand was yet to come.
Cora's eyes widened as she hung on Kaltor's every word.
General Curie had promised to fight to the last man, and he was true to his word. By then, he had only 300 soldiers left, but he wasn't finished. Under the cover of darkness, he gave one final order. March south, silently, with no lights.
Cora's voice was barely a whisper. Did they? Kaltor nodded.
In total silence, the dragon's remaining soldiers moved deep into the Terran ranks. Even now, it remains a mystery how so many managed to pass through the Terran sentries undetected. By the time the Terrans realized what had happened, it was too late. The dragon's soldiers had surrounded one of the Terran camps.
He paused for dramatic effect.
And then they shouted, "Banzai!" and charged.
Cora gasped with a slight jump. Kaltor's voice then grew tense.
They tore through the camp, slashing and stabbing in the dead of night, catching the Terrans completely off guard. Mass confusion broke out as the Terran soldiers scrambled to defend themselves. Another nearby camp heard the noise and quickly sent in reinforcements, but the damage was already done.
Did they stop them? Cora couldn't help but ask. Kaltor nodded, though his voice remained somber.
Yes, the final enemy troops were dealt with, but the cost was great. Many heroes on both sides fell that night, and just as General Curie had vowed, his soldiers fought to the very end. He kept his promise.
Cora's voice was small, almost hesitant. But what about General Curie? Did he die? Kaltor's gaze softened as he answered.
No one knows for sure, little one. In the center of the battlefield where Curie had made his final stand, a massive crater was found. The walls of the crater were made of melted volcanic rock, as if the general had unleashed such heat and fury that he melted himself, along with anyone who dared challenge him. His body was never found.
Cora asked incredulously, so he just disappeared? Kaltor smiled gently.
That's the mystery, isn't it? Some say he burned himself into legend, leaving nothing behind but fire and ash.
Cora tilted her head. And what about the Dragon Emperor? Kaltor's eyes twinkled as he leaned back.
Ah, little one, that is a story for another time.
Cora leaned back, her mind swirling with thoughts of the tale she had just heard. The images of dragons, brave soldiers, and fierce battles danced in her head. After a moment, she looked up at Kaltor and asked, "Did that really happen?" Kaltor's feathers shifted gently as he smiled.
Terran stories are full of both fact and fiction, little one. The Terrans have a saying, history is written by the victors. That, along with their short lifespans, sometimes leads to embellishments. It is for this reason we must consider the historical documents as fiction.
Cora's eyes flickered with curiosity. All of it? Kaltor chuckled softly.
Anything for which we don't have direct supporting evidence, yes. So much of their history has been lost to their ever-changing technology and flawed archival systems. It has only been the last few Crone that we can say with certainty that their records are fact.
He paused, his feathers glimmering in the soft light.
But I think we can safely say there was once a great battle on an important island between two powerful forces. One side was victorious. From that, we can take lessons from the tactics and let our imaginations run free with the narrative, secure in the knowledge that the strife of the past remains in the past so long as we learn the lessons provided.
Cora nodded, a yawn escaping her as the weight of sleep began to settle over her. "I think I understand," she said, her voice growing softer. "Good night, Sage."
"Good night, Cora,"
Kaltor replied, his voice gentle as she drifted off to sleep, thoughts of the Terrans and their fantastical stories finding their way into her dreams.